The morning started like any other at the small town school. The hallway floors still carried the smell of fresh cleaning liquid, and the sound of chairs dragging across classroom tiles echoed in the distance. Teachers moved quickly from one room to another, holding files and lesson plans, already tired even though the day had barely begun. In the middle of all this movement, she quietly pushed her cleaning cart down the long corridor. She always arrived before sunrise. It was easier that way. Fewer eyes, fewer conversations. She preferred to finish most of her work before students filled the building with noise and energy. Her clothes were simple and neat. Her hair was tied back carefully. She never rushed, yet she was never slow. Every task she did carried a kind of silent care. Most people at the school knew her only as the cleaning lady. Some didn't even know her full name. A few teachers greeted her politely in passing, but many walked by without noticing her at all. It was not done with cruelty. It was simply habit. People often looked through her rather than at her. That week, the school was preparing for its annual cultural event. It was the biggest program of the year. Parents would attend. Local community members would come. The stage in the auditorium had already been decorated with bright curtains and paper lights made by students. The excitement was everywhere. But behind the excitement, there was stress. The hired pianist for the event had suddenly canceled. The news came 2 days before the final rehearsal. The music teacher stood near the auditorium stage, holding her phone tightly, speaking in a worried tone. "What do you mean you can't come? We already announced your name," she said, pacing back and forth. Other teachers gathered nearby, whispering, "What will we do now? We can't run the program without live piano. Should we just use recordings? That won't feel special." The tension slowly filled the room. Later that afternoon, while students were in class, she entered the auditorium with her cart. It was her job to clean the stage area before the next rehearsal. The large grand piano stood in the center, covered with a protective cloth. She paused when she saw it. Her hands slowed. For a brief moment, the busy world around her seemed to fade. She stepped closer and gently removed a small corner of the cover, just enough to see the black polished surface underneath. Her reflection looked back at her. She did not smile, but her eyes softened. Carefully, she placed her fingers on the edge of the piano. She did not press any keys. She only let her hand rest there, as if greeting an old friend. She had not touched a piano in years. A sudden voice interrupted her quiet moment. "Do you know how to play that?" one of the teachers asked casually from the back of the hall. She quickly stepped back and lowered her hand. A little," she replied softly. The teacher raised an eyebrow. "A little?" Another teacher nearby chuckled lightly. "Well, we need someone right now. Maybe you can help us." They were half joking. The stress of the canceled pianist had made everyone restless. The idea of the cleaning lady playing seemed almost amusing. She shook her head gently. "No, it has been many years." The music teacher, who had been standing quietly, looked at her more carefully. "You've played before?" She nodded, but her eyes stayed lowered. "How much?" She hesitated. "When I was young." There was a short silence. One teacher sighed. "At this point, we don't have many choices. We just need someone to play basic background music during rehearsals. Nothing complicated." Another added, "Yes, just simple chords. Even that would help." The music teacher walked closer. "Would you mind trying? Just for practice. If it doesn't work, we'll figure something else out." All the eyes in the room turned toward her. She felt her chest tighten slightly. Being watched made her uncomfortable. She preferred the quiet corners of the building, the places where she could move freely without attention. "I don't know if I remember," she said honestly. "That's okay," the music teacher replied gently. "Just try." It was not exactly pressure, but it was not fully a choice either. The teachers needed help, and she had already admitted she could play a little. Saying no now would feel strange. Slowly, she stepped toward the piano. The music teacher removed the protective cover completely. The black surface shined under the stage lights. Dust from the curtains floated gently in the air. She stood beside the bench for a moment before sitting down. The wood felt familiar beneath her fingers as she adjusted the seat slightly. Her hands rested in her lap. The room was very quiet. A few students who had stayed back for rehearsal peeked inside the auditorium. They whispered to each other when they saw who was sitting at the piano. "She works here. Can she even play? Maybe this will be funny." She heard the whispers. She pretended not to. Her fingers hovered above the keys. For a second, doubt filled her mind. What if she truly had forgotten? What if her hands no longer remembered what her heart once knew? She closed her eyes briefly. In that small moment of silence, old memories tried to return. A small room with a tall window. The sound of a metronome ticking steadily. A strict but patient instructor correcting her posture. Long afternoons practicing scales until her fingers felt numb. Then life had changed. Responsibilities had grown heavier. Dreams had become quiet. Music had slowly moved into the background. She opened her eyes. Gently, she pressed one key. The sound echoed softly through the auditorium. Then another key. A simple melody began to form. It was slow and careful, like someone testing the temperature of water before stepping in. One teacher folded her arms, watching closely. Another glanced at the music teacher, as if silently asking, "Is this enough?" Her hands moved again, this time a little more confidently. The melody continued. It was simple, yes, but it was steady. Her fingers did not shake anymore. They seemed to remember where to go. The students stopped whispering. The music teacher leaned slightly forward. Something was different. The cleaning lady who usually moved quietly through hallways now sat upright. Her shoulders relaxed but strong. Her hands traveled across the keys with increasing ease. The simple melody slowly grew richer, fuller. It no longer sounded like someone playing a little. It sounded like someone who understood the piano. She shifted into another sequence without hesitation. The transition was smooth, natural. Her left hand supported the rhythm while her right hand carried the tune effortlessly. The teachers exchanged looks. This was not what they expected. The music in the auditorium felt alive. It filled the empty seats and touched the high ceiling. Even the air seemed to listen. She did not look at anyone while playing. Her focus remained on the keys. Yet her expression had changed. There was no fear now. No embarrassment. Only connection. The piece grew slightly more complex. Not dramatic, not showy, just deeper. The kind of depth that comes from years of quiet practice. When she finally lifted her fingers, the last note lingered gently before fading away. No one spoke for a few seconds. The silence felt heavier than the music. The music teacher cleared her throat softly. "You said, you played when you were young?" She nodded. "For how long?" She hesitated again, unsure how much to reveal. "A long time," she answered simply. One of the teachers let out a quiet breath. That didn't sound simple. She looked down at her hands, almost as if surprised by them. "I just remembered," she said, but deep inside, she knew she had never truly forgotten. The teachers were no longer smiling in amusement. Now their faces showed curiosity and something else. Respect, perhaps. The music teacher spoke gently. "Could you come again tomorrow? Just for rehearsal?" She paused. For years, she had kept this part of herself hidden. Not because she was ashamed, but because life had not left space for it. Now suddenly that quiet part was standing in the light. "I can try," she replied softly. As she stood up from the bench, the students in the doorway stepped aside. They looked at her differently now. Not as the woman pushing a cart down the hallway, but as someone they did not fully understand yet. She returned the protective cover over the piano carefully, smoothing it with her hand. Then she picked up her cleaning cart again. The hallway outside was just as noisy as before. Teachers rushed past her, discussing schedules and decorations. The world had not changed, but something small had shifted, and deep inside her heart, a door that had been closed for years had quietly opened again. The next morning felt different for her, even though nothing around her had changed. The sun rose the same way, pale and quiet over the town. The streets were still half empty when she stepped off the small bus and walked toward the school building. She carried her usual bag and wore the same simple clothes. On the outside, she looked exactly as she always did. But inside, her thoughts were louder than usual. She had not expected to sit at the piano the day before. She had not expected the teachers to look at her the way they did after she finished playing. All night, the memory of those few minutes stayed with her. Not the applause, not the silence, but the feeling of the keys under her fingers. It felt like waking up a part of herself that had been asleep for years. When she entered the school, a few students were already in the hallway. Some of them glanced at her and whispered softly. She caught a few words this time. That's her. She played yesterday. She's actually good. She kept her eyes forward and continued walking. She did not know how to respond to attention. Felt strange. As she reached the storage room to leave her bag, the music teacher appeared at the door. I'm glad you came, the teacher said gently. She nodded. I always come. The teacher smiled. I mean, for rehearsal. There was a short pause. We're starting in an hour. I was hoping you could try playing with the students this time. She felt a small nervous movement in her chest again. Yesterday she had played alone. Today would be different. Today there would be singing, coordination, eyes watching more closely. I will try, she said quietly. The music teacher studied her face for a moment. You don't have to feel pressured. If you're uncomfortable, just say so. She appreciated the kindness. But she also knew something important. If she stepped away now, she might never sit at that piano again. I will try, she repeated, this time a little more firmly. An hour later, the auditorium was full of movement. Students practiced lines for a short play. Others adjusted microphones. A group of girls stood near the stage holding sheets of lyrics for a song that needed piano accompaniment. When she walked in, the room slowly settled. The piano waited at the center again. She walked toward it with steady steps, though her palms felt slightly warm. This time, more students were watching openly. There was curiosity in their faces. Some looked excited. Others looked doubtful, still unsure of what to expect. She sat down. The music teacher handed her the sheet music for the performance piece. It was not extremely advanced, but it required control and timing. Let's start from the beginning, the teacher said to the students. She glanced at the paper. For a second, her mind calculated quietly. The notes were clear. The structure was familiar. It was not difficult, but it needed emotion. She placed her fingers on the keys. The first chord sounded stronger than the day before. Not loud, but confident. The students began to sing. At first, their voices were slightly off rhythm. It was normal for rehearsal, but she adjusted quickly. Her left hand anchored the tempo, steady and supportive. Her right hand guided the melody forward, helping the singers find their place. Something unexpected began to happen. Instead of following the students began to follow her. Her playing created a foundation that made them feel safe. Their voices grew clearer. Their timing improved. Even their expressions changed. The music teacher noticed it immediately. Again, the teacher said, but this time with a smile. They started over. Now she added something small, a gentle variation between verses. It was subtle, almost unnoticeable to an untrained ear, but it made the song feel alive. Not mechanical, not flat. A boy near the front lowered his lyric sheet and simply listened for a moment. After finishing the second run, a few students clapped quietly without being told to. She quickly looked down, almost embarrassed by the reaction. One student spoke up. Miss, how did you learn to play like that? The word miss surprised her. Most students had never addressed her that way. She thought for a moment before answering. I practiced, she said simply. How long? Another student asked. A long time ago, she replied. The music teacher stepped in gently. Let's take a 5-minute break. Students gathered in small groups, talking excitedly. Some glanced at her with open admiration now. The same students who once passed her in hallways without noticing her existence were now whispering about her talent. She remained seated at the piano, flipping the edge of the sheet music slowly. The music teacher approached again. You read that perfectly, the teacher said quietly. She shrugged slightly. It is not very difficult. The teacher studied her more carefully. For most people, it is. She did not respond. Instead, she played a few soft notes absent-mindedly while they talked. The sound flowed naturally, like breathing. The teacher hesitated before asking the next question. Did you ever perform? On stage. Her hands paused over the keys. Yes, she said after a few seconds. When I was younger. Where? She gave the name of a city far from the small town. A city known for its music schools and competitions. The teacher's eyebrows lifted slightly. That's not small. She gave a small smile. No. Before the conversation could continue, the students returned for the next rehearsal round. This time, the music teacher made a small change. Let's try the second piece, she announced. The second piece was more demanding. It included faster tempo shifts and a short instrumental section where the piano played alone. The teacher looked at her carefully. Is that okay? She nodded. They began. The opening moved quickly. Her fingers traveled across the keys with smooth control. The tempo increased. A few teachers who had come in earlier out of curiosity now stood at the back of the hall. They remembered the light laughter from the day before when someone suggested she could play. There was no laughter now. When the instrumental section arrived, the singers stepped back slightly, leaving her alone with the piano. The hall felt larger in that moment. She did not rush. Her hands moved with precision, but there was emotion behind every phrase. The notes did not just sound correct. They felt meaningful. The faster passage came, the one that often caused mistakes during practice. She played it cleanly. Not one note was lost. The final chord landed firmly, echoing against the auditorium walls. This time, the applause was not quiet. Even the teachers clapped openly. She stood up quickly, almost as if trying to escape the attention. The music teacher stepped onto the stage beside her. I think we have found our pianist, the teacher said, looking around the room. There were nods everywhere. One teacher who had been doubtful before spoke honestly. We had no idea. She lowered her gaze again. I did not think it mattered, but it did matter. The realization slowly spread across the room. They had been working beside someone extraordinary without ever asking about her story. Rehearsal continued for another hour. Each time she played, her confidence grew slightly. Not in a proud way. In a peaceful way. During a short pause, a young girl approached the piano carefully. Can you teach me that part? The girl asked shyly. She looked at the small hands resting on the edge of the instrument. Sit, she said gently. The girl climbed onto the bench beside her. She adjusted the girl's fingers softly. Relax your hand. Do not press too hard. The girl tried again. A small smile appeared on her face, not from praise but from sharing. The music teacher watched from a distance. Something important was happening. This was no longer just about solving the problem of a cancelled pianist. It was about discovering something hidden in plain sight. As the rehearsal ended, the teachers gathered briefly near the stage. We should announce her properly in the program, one suggested. Yes, another agreed. She deserves credit. She overheard the conversation and felt a mixture of emotions. For years, she had lived comfortably in the background. Now, the background was slowly fading. When she returned to her cleaning duties later that afternoon, the hallways felt different again. Students greeted her. Some smiled widely. A few even said, "See you tomorrow, Mississippi." She responded softly each time. But as she pushed her cart down the corridor, she felt something steady inside her. It was not pride. It was recognition. For the first time in many years, she was not invisible. And tomorrow she would sit at that piano again. Not because she was forced, but because she was needed. By the third day, the news had spread beyond the auditorium. Students were talking about it during lunch. A few parents had already heard from their children that the school's cleaning lady was now the pianist for the annual event. Some teachers who had not attended the earlier rehearsals made quiet excuses to pass by the auditorium just to see for themselves. She noticed the change even though no one said it directly. People looked at her longer now. Not in the usual distracted way. Not the way people glance at someone who blends into the background. This time, their eyes held curiosity. That morning, before rehearsal, she arrived earlier than usual. She stood outside the locked auditorium doors for a moment, holding the small ring of keys given to her for cleaning. The hallway was empty. The building felt calm. She unlocked the door and stepped inside. The stage lights were still off. The chairs were lined up neatly from the night before. The grand piano sat in the center, covered again with its dark cloth. She closed the door behind her. For the first time in years, she was alone with a piano in a quiet room. She walked slowly toward it and removed the cover completely. The faint morning light coming through the high windows reflected on the polished surface. She sat down. There was no audience this time. No teachers. No whispering students. Just her. She placed her hands on the keys and began to play something different. Not the rehearsal pieces. Not the songs from the program. This melody came from memory. Started gently, almost like a question. The notes moved slowly at first, careful and thoughtful. Then they grew stronger, more expressive. It was a piece she had practiced hundreds of times when she was younger. A piece that once felt impossible until she mastered it. As she played, the auditorium disappeared. In her mind, she was no longer in a small town school. She was a child again, sitting in a narrow practice room with cream-colored walls. Her feet barely touched the pedals. A tall clock ticked loudly in the corner. Outside the window, city traffic hummed endlessly. Her instructor's voice echoed in her memory. Again. Slower. Feel the phrase. Her childhood had not been ordinary. While other children played freely after school, she often sat at the piano for hours. Her parents had believed deeply in her talent. They had sacrificed comfort so she could attend a respected music academy in the city. There had been competitions. There had been small trophies placed carefully on a shelf. There had been applause that once filled her with pride. But there had also been pressure. Practice before sunrise. Practice after dinner. Weekends filled with lessons instead of rest. She had loved the piano, but life outside music slowly became heavier. Her family's financial situation changed suddenly when her father fell ill. Medical bills replaced music fees. The city apartment felt smaller with each passing month. Decisions had to be made. She remembered the day clearly. Her mother sat beside her at the kitchen table, holding her hands gently. "We will pause for now," her mother had said softly. Pause. That was the word they used. But the pause stretched longer than anyone expected. Responsibilities came quickly after that. She began working small jobs to support the household. 1 year turned into 2, 2 into 5. The piano lessons faded into memory. She had promised herself she would return to it. But sometimes life moves quietly in another direction. The melody in the auditorium grew stronger as she remembered. Her fingers did not hesitate. They knew the path. A wrong note slipped in once, but she corrected it naturally without panic. Her hands still carried discipline. They still carried training. As she reached the final movement of the piece, emotion rose in her chest. Not sadness exactly. Not regret. Something softer. Acceptance. When the final chord echoed through the empty hall, she exhaled slowly. "You never stopped," a voice said quietly from the doorway. She turned quickly. The music teacher stood there, leaning lightly against the frame. The teacher must have arrived early as well. "I didn't mean to interrupt," the teacher added gently. She lowered her hands from the keys. "I was only practicing." "That didn't sound like practice," the teacher replied. There was no teasing in the tone this time, only sincerity. The teacher walked slowly toward the stage. "What was that piece?" She hesitated. "It is something I played many years ago." It sounded professional. She gave a small shrug. "I studied seriously." "How seriously?" She looked at the piano instead of answering immediately. "I was preparing for conservatory entrance exams," she said quietly. The teacher stopped walking. "That level?" She nodded. The word hung in the air. Conservatory. That was not casual learning. That was advanced training. Years of dedication. The teacher sat in one of the front seats, absorbing the information. Why did you stop? The question was simple. The answer was not. Life changed, she said. The teacher understood without needing every detail. They sat in silence for a moment. Then the teacher spoke again. Do you ever wish you had continued? She thought carefully. There was a time when I felt regret, she admitted. But regret is heavy. I learned to carry something lighter. And what is that? Gratitude that I had the chance at all. The teacher smiled slowly. Rehearsal began soon after. Students filled the auditorium again, unaware of the quiet conversation that had just taken place. But something had shifted. The music teacher now looked at her not just with curiosity, but with deep respect. That day's rehearsal included a new challenge. One of the teachers suggested adding a short solo piano introduction to open the event. It would make the program feel more elegant, someone said. All eyes turned toward her. She felt the weight of their expectation. What kind of introduction? She asked calmly. Something classical, the music teacher replied. Something beautiful. She considered it. The idea of standing alone on stage in front of a full audience after so many years felt overwhelming. But at the same time, a quiet voice inside her whispered that this was not an accident. I can prepare something, she said. Students reacted with excitement. During the break, several gathered near her again. Were you famous? One asked boldly. She smiled gently. No. Did you win competitions? Another pressed. A few, she answered simply. Why didn't you become a professional pianist? She looked at the young faces around her. Sometimes dreams change shape, she said. They did not fully understand yet. But one day they would. As rehearsal continued, she noticed something new. The teachers were no longer guiding her. They were trusting her. When tempo adjustments were needed, they looked at her first. When students struggled with pitch, they asked her to repeat certain passages. Her presence at the piano no longer felt temporary. It felt necessary. By the end of the day, even the school principal had stepped in briefly to observe. The principal stood quietly at the back, listening as she played through the closing piece. Afterward, the principal approached her directly. I hear you have been hiding from us, the principal said kindly. She shook her head. I was not hiding. Then we were not looking carefully enough, the principal replied. That sentence stayed with her. As the auditorium emptied again in the evening, she remained behind to clean up. But this time, cleaning did not feel like the only reason she was there. She wiped down the piano gently, her touch careful and respectful. For years, she had believed that part of her life was over. Now she realized something important. Talent does not disappear. It waits. And sometimes, it waits quietly in hallways where no one thinks to search for it. Before leaving for the day, she sat at the piano once more. Just for a minute. She played a few soft notes, not for rehearsal, not for approval. Just for herself. And for the first time in many years, the sound did not feel like memory. It felt like the present. The announcement was made 2 days later. During the final rehearsal meeting, the principal stood on the stage with a small paper in hand and cleared his throat. Teachers and students gathered in the auditorium seats, waiting for final instructions about the annual event. There has been a change in our program, he began. This year, we will open the evening with a live piano introduction performed by someone from our own school. A soft murmur moved through the room. He turned toward her, where she stood quietly near the side curtain. Please welcome the pianist for this year's event. For a moment, she did not move. The music teacher gently nodded at her. She stepped forward slowly. The applause started small, then grew louder. Students who had once whispered now clapped with genuine excitement. A few even cheered. She felt heat rise to her face, but she kept walking until she reached the center of the stage. She was not used to standing under bright lights without a piano in front of her. It felt more exposing than sitting behind the instrument. The principal smiled. Many of us have recently discovered a wonderful talent among us, he said. Sometimes, greatness stands beside us quietly, and we fail to notice it. The words were kind, but they carried truth. She bowed her head slightly, unsure how to respond to so much attention. After the short announcement, rehearsal continued. But everything felt different now. The secret was no longer a secret. Now there were expectations. Later that afternoon, the music teacher approached her with a folder. "I have been thinking about your opening piece," the teacher said. "You can choose something you truly love, not just something safe." The word safe made her pause. For years she had chosen safe. Safe work. Safe routine. Safe silence. Now she had the chance to choose something bold. That evening, after finishing her cleaning duties, she stayed behind in the auditorium again. The building grew quiet as the sun set outside. She placed the folder on the piano and opened it. Inside were several classical pieces suggested by the music teacher. Some were elegant and calm. Others were dramatic and technically demanding. Her eyes stopped on one piece in particular. It was the same composition she had practiced early that morning when she thought no one was listening. A difficult piece. A piece that required strength, control, and emotion. A piece she once performed in a city competition years ago. Her hands rested lightly on the sheet music. Could she still do it on a stage in front of hundreds of people? She took a deep breath and began to play. The opening was slow and reflective. Each note needed careful shaping. She focused on dynamics, letting the softer passages breathe fully before moving into stronger sections. At first, her fingers felt slightly stiff. Not weak, just cautious. She stopped halfway through. "This is not practice anymore," she whispered to herself. She started again. This time, she did not hold back. Her hands moved with determination. The faster sections demanded precision, and she gave it. The powerful chords required confidence, and she leaned into them. When she reached the most difficult passage, the one that once kept her awake at night during her youth, her heart beat faster. She closed her eyes briefly. Then she played it cleanly. No hesitation, no fear. When the final chord echoed into the empty auditorium, she realized something important. She was no longer trying to prove anything. She was simply expressing herself. The next day, rehearsal included a full run-through of the entire program in order. Teachers sat scattered throughout the auditorium, pretending to observe casually but clearly evaluating every detail. When it was her turn to practice the opening introduction, the room grew quiet. She walked to the piano alone. This was the first time she would perform the full piece in front of everyone. She adjusted the bench, placed her hands, and began. The opening notes flowed gently, filling the space like soft light. The students backstage stopped whispering. Even the teachers in the back rows leaned forward slightly. As the piece progressed, the music deepened. There was a section where the melody rose high and clear, almost like a voice calling out. She played it with warmth, not force. Then came the powerful middle passage. Her hands moved quickly across the keys, yet every note landed exactly where it should. The rhythm was steady. The sound was full but controlled. The music teacher felt a chill run down her arms. This was not someone who had simply learned a little. This was mastery. When the final notes rang out, the silence lasted longer than expected. Then the auditorium filled with applause. Not polite applause, real applause. One teacher wiped tears quietly. The principal stood up from his seat. Students looked at each other in disbelief. She stood slowly from the bench, unsure where to look. The music teacher approached her on stage. "You were meant to be here," the teacher said softly. She felt her throat tighten. "For a long time, I believed that part of my life was over," she admitted. The teacher shook her head gently. "It was waiting." That afternoon, something unexpected happened. A parent who had come early to pick up a child had quietly entered the auditorium during the rehearsal. He happened to be someone who worked in the city's cultural department, involved in organizing community concerts. He approached the principal after rehearsal. "Who is she?" he asked. The principal explained briefly. The man looked thoughtful. "She should not remain hidden," he said. When the principal later mentioned this conversation to her, she felt overwhelmed. "I am not looking for recognition," she said quickly. Recognition is not the same as pride, the principal replied. It is acknowledgement. That evening, she walked home more slowly than usual. Her mind was full. The town streets were calm, small shops closing for the night. She passed by houses with warm lights glowing in windows. Years ago, she had imagined performing in large concert halls. She had pictured bright stages and distant cities. Life had taken her somewhere else. But perhaps somewhere else was not lesser. Perhaps it was simply different. The day of the event was now only 3 days away. Excitement filled the school. Decorations were finalized. Programs were printed with her name listed clearly under opening piano performance. Seeing her name in print felt unreal. She touched the paper lightly when the music teacher handed her a copy. "You earned this," the teacher said. She smiled gently. That night, she practiced once more in the empty auditorium. Not to fix mistakes, not to impress anyone, but to connect fully with the music. As she played, she understood something she had not understood when she was younger. Back then, music had been about achievement. Now it was about meaning. She was not the same girl chasing competitions anymore. She was a woman who had lived, struggled, worked quietly, and carried responsibility. And all of that life experience now flowed into every note she played. When she finally closed the piano and covered it carefully, she stood on the stage for a moment and looked out at the empty seats. Soon they would be filled. Soon there would be lights, applause, and attention. But in that quiet moment, she felt something stronger than nervousness. She felt ready, not because she needed to prove her talent, but because she was no longer hiding from it. The day of the event arrived with a strange mix of excitement and calm. From early morning, the school building felt different. Chairs were arranged in perfect rows inside the auditorium. Fresh flowers were placed near the entrance. A red cloth covered the long table where special guests would sit. Students walked around wearing neat clothes instead of uniforms, holding programs in their hands and practicing their lines one last time. She arrived earlier than usual. Not because she had cleaning to do, but because she needed a quiet moment before everything began. When she entered the auditorium, the lights were still dim. Only the stage lights above the piano were softly glowing. The instrument stood in the center, polished and uncovered, waiting. She walked toward it slowly, feeling every step. Tonight, there would be parents, teachers, community members, and guests filling every seat. The hall would no longer be empty and forgiving. It would be alive. She placed her hand gently on the piano's surface. "This is just music," she whispered to herself. Nothing more. But she knew it was more. It was years of silence finding its voice. It was a dream that had once faded, now standing under bright lights again. The music teacher entered quietly and smiled when she saw her. "You're early," the teacher said. "I wanted to breathe before everyone comes," she replied. The teacher nodded with understanding. Nervous, she thought about the question carefully. "A little," she admitted, "but not afraid." That answer surprised even her. They sat together in the front row for a few minutes, looking at the stage. "You know," the teacher said softly, "this event was important before, but now it feels meaningful in a different way." She looked at the teacher. "Why?" "Because tonight is not only about students performing. It's about showing them that life does not end when plans change." Those words settled deeply inside her. By late afternoon, the school was full. Parents arrived holding cameras. Children ran excitedly through the hallways before being guided to their assigned places. Teachers moved quickly, checking microphones and sound levels. She waited backstage, wearing a simple but elegant outfit the music teacher had encouraged her to choose. It was nothing expensive, just neat and graceful. Her hair was tied back carefully. She held the printed program in her hands. There it was. Opening piano performance. Her name written clearly beneath it. For years, her name had been written only on cleaning schedules and supply lists. Tonight, it stood at the top of the program. The principal stepped onto the stage as the audience settled into their seats. The soft murmur of conversations slowly faded. She could hear the principal's voice through the speakers backstage, welcoming everyone warmly and thanking parents for their support. Then came the moment. And now, the principal announced, "We begin this evening with a special piano introduction." Her heart beat steadily. Not fast. Steady. The music teacher gave her a small nod. She walked onto the stage. The bright lights felt warmer than during rehearsal. For a brief second, she could not see the faces in the audience clearly, only shapes and shadows beyond the light. But she could feel them. Hundreds of eyes. Waiting. She reached the piano bench and sat down. She adjusted the bench slightly the same way she always did. Placed her hands on her lap. Closed her eyes for one slow breath. When she opened them, her fingers moved to the keys. The first note filled the hall. Clear. Soft. Confident. The opening melody flowed like gentle water. The audience grew completely silent. Even small children stopped moving. She focused only on the music, not on the crowd. Not on the lights. The piece unfolded naturally. Each phrase connected smoothly to the next. Her hands moved with strength during the powerful sections and softened beautifully during the quiet moments. In the audience, the music teacher sat with folded hands, barely breathing. The principal leaned forward slightly in his seat. Parents exchanged surprised looks. Some had expected a simple school-level performance. What they were hearing was something else entirely. As she reached the most demanding part of the piece, her fingers traveled quickly across the keys. The rhythm was precise. The emotion was controlled but deep. There was no rush, no panic, only focus. In that moment, she was not a cleaning lady. She was not someone who had stepped away from music years ago. She was exactly what she had always been. A pianist. The final movement approached. The melody rose higher, almost shining. Then it slowly descended into a gentle closing phrase. Her hands lifted slightly for the last chord. And then silence. The final note echoed softly before disappearing into the air. For a second, no one moved. Then the auditorium exploded into applause. Not polite clapping. Not forced appreciation. It was loud, strong, full. Some people stood up immediately. Others followed. A standing ovation. She remained seated for a moment, overwhelmed by the sound. When she finally stood, she turned toward the audience and bowed her head. She could now see faces clearly. Parents smiling. Students cheering. Teachers clapping with pride. Her eyes searched the crowd instinctively. She imagined her parents sitting somewhere among them, even though they were not there. She hoped they would have been proud. When she stepped off the stage, the music teacher embraced her gently. "You didn't just play," the teacher whispered. "You moved everyone." She felt tears rising but managed a soft smile. The rest of the program continued smoothly. Students performed their songs and acted in their play with new energy, inspired by the powerful opening. Backstage, many students approached her between performances. "You were amazing. I didn't know someone like you worked here. Will you teach us more?" She listened to each one patiently. "I am still learning too," she told them honestly. Later, as the event ended and families began leaving, several parents came forward to speak with her. One mother held her daughter's hand and said, "My child wants to learn piano seriously now. Would you consider teaching?" Another parent added, "We had no idea such talent was in this school." She responded humbly, almost shyly. "I only played," she said. But everyone knew it was more than that. The principal joined the small group near the stage. "We would like to offer you something," he said carefully. She looked at him, surprised. "We have been discussing creating an after-school music program. If you are willing, we would like you to lead it." The words felt unreal. "Lead?" she repeated softly. "Yes," the principal said. "You have already inspired the students more than we expected." She looked at the piano again. For years, she believed her connection with it belonged to the past. Now it was shaping her future. "I would be honored," she said quietly. That night, after everyone had left and the chairs were being folded away, she remained in the auditorium for a few extra minutes. The hall was quiet again. The same stage, the same piano, but everything felt different. She sat down once more and pressed a single soft note. Not for applause, not for recognition, just for herself. This time, the sound carried no sadness about lost years. Carried gratitude. She understood now that sometimes life takes a person away from their dreams not to erase them, but to reshape them. She had returned to music in a way she never expected. Not in a grand concert hall, not in a distant city, but in a small school auditorium, surrounded by students who now looked at her with admiration and hope. As she covered the piano carefully and turned off the stage lights, she felt peaceful. The applause from earlier still echoed in her memory, but it was no longer the most important sound. The most important sound was the quiet certainty inside her heart. She was no longer invisible, and she would never hide her music again. The weeks after the event passed quickly, but the feeling of that night did not fade. Students still talked about the performance in the hallways. Some tried to replay small clips on their phones, showing friends who had missed it. Teachers mentioned it during staff meetings, not only as a successful program but as a reminder of how easily people can be misunderstood. For her, life did not suddenly become dramatic or glamorous. She still arrived early in the morning. She still carried her cleaning cart. She still wiped desks and swept hallways. But something inside her had changed. She no longer walked with her eyes lowered. She greeted people first sometimes. And when students smiled at her, she smiled back without hesitation. True to their promise, the school began organizing an after-school music program. A small classroom near the auditorium was cleared and fitted with 2 upright pianos that had been stored away for years. Dust was cleaned. Keys were repaired. Benches were adjusted. The principal placed a simple sign on the door, "Music Room." Underneath, in smaller letters, her name was written as the instructor. The first day of the program, she stood in the doorway watching as students slowly gathered. Some were shy. Some were excited. A few looked unsure, as if wondering whether they truly belonged there. She understood that feeling very well. "Come in," she said gently. They entered one by one. There were no speeches, no long introductions. She simply sat at the piano and played a short, warm melody. The room grew quiet. "Music is not about being perfect," she began. "It is about listening." She looked at their faces. Listening to the sound. Listening to yourself. A small boy raised his hand. "Were you famous before?" he asked. She smiled. "No," she answered. "I practiced a lot. That is all." He seemed satisfied with that response. Lessons began with the basics. Hand position, posture, simple scales. Some students struggled to keep their fingers curved. Others pressed the keys too hard. She corrected them patiently. "Relax your wrist. Let the sound breathe. Do not fight the piano. Work with it." The music teacher occasionally visited to observe. Each time she noticed something beautiful. The woman who once stood quietly in corners now spoke with calm authority. Not loud, not strict, but confident. Her instructions were clear. Her encouragement sincere. When a student made a mistake, she did not criticize harshly. She simply said, "Try again," and they did. Word about the program spread beyond the school. A few parents requested private lessons. She hesitated at first, unsure if she was ready for that level of responsibility again. But the principal reminded her gently, "You have already carried much heavier responsibilities in life." So she agreed. Her evenings slowly filled with small groups of children sitting beside her at the piano, repeating exercises and laughing when their fingers slipped on the keys. She did not teach the way her strict childhood instructor had taught her. She remembered the pressure she once felt. Instead, she chose balance. Discipline, yes, but also joy. One afternoon, after class ended, the music teacher sat beside her. "Have you thought about performing outside the school?" the teacher asked carefully. She shook her head. "This is enough. But you could do more." She looked at the rows of empty chairs in the music room. "Maybe," she said, "but I do not need more applause. I need meaning." The teacher nodded slowly. She had already found it. Months passed. The students prepared for a small winter recital organized by the new music program. It was nothing grand, just parents sitting in folding chairs, watching their children play simple pieces they had worked hard to learn. She stood at the side of the room during the recital, not on stage this time. One by one, the students performed. Some made small mistakes and blushed. Some forgot a few notes and started again. Each time, she gave them a reassuring nod. When the final student finished, the applause filled the room warmly. The principal stepped forward and surprised her. "Before we end," he said, "we would like to thank the person who made this program possible." He invited her to the front. She hesitated, but the students began clapping and calling her forward. She stood before them, not as someone who had been discovered by accident, but as someone who had chosen to step into the light. Looking at the children in front of her, she felt something stronger than pride. She felt purpose. Later that evening, after everyone had left, she remained alone in the music room. She sat at the piano once again. Her life had not followed the path she once imagined as a young girl in the city. She had not entered a grand conservatory. She had not toured the world. But she had returned to music in a way that mattered deeply. She began playing softly. The melody was simple this time. Not complex, not dramatic, just honest. As the notes filled the small classroom, she reflected on the journey. Being forced to sit at that piano during rehearsal had felt uncomfortable at first. She had wanted to remain unseen. But sometimes life pushes a person not to embarrass them, but to remind them of who they are. The teachers who once underestimated her now consulted her with respect. Students who once walked past her now greeted her proudly. Parents who had never noticed her presence now thanked her sincerely. And yet, the most important change was not in how others saw her. It was in how she saw herself. She no longer described her past as something lost. She described it as something paused, and now resumed. Before locking the music room for the night, she touched the top of the piano gently. "Thank you," she whispered, not to the instrument, but to the journey. The next morning, she returned to her routine once more. Sunrise, quiet hallways, cleaning cart. But when she passed the auditorium doors, she did not feel like someone standing outside a world she once belonged to. She felt like someone who had built a new world inside it. Students waved as they passed her. "See you in music class," one called out happily. She smiled. "See you." And as she continued down the hallway, her steps were steady and light. Not because her life had become perfect, but because she had learned something powerful. Talent does not disappear when life becomes difficult. It waits patiently, and when the moment comes, it rises not only to impress others, but to remind a person of their own worth. In the end, she was never just a cleaning lady. She was never just a forgotten dream. She was, and always had been, a pianist. And now she was also a teacher. That was more than enough.